everybody. Welcome to the Asheville Drupal Meetup. Today we're going to talk about Vue.js. And if there is anyone out there in live stream world, hello. You can't see me, but I'm waving. I'll wave my mouse cursor.
Lee's on.
Hey, Lee. Welcome to the meetup. So I'm going to wait another minute or two before really getting into it, in case some people show up late. And we're in a situation where we have to let people in the door manually here at the meetup space. So just in case people text or call, let's give it a moment. In the meantime, I'm going to say, I guess, I don't know. I don't really have anything to talk about in the meantime. Has anybody done anything interesting with Drupal or Vue.js lately? Yeah.
I made a cool math thing.
Oh, right.
XY plane. I don't have it on the internet anywhere though, so that might not be a good example.
Well, you got a GIF of it. I'm gonna load that up.
I do have that, yeah.
Yeah. So, just to, hey, how's it going?
Hey.
Probably easier to show. So here's just a random thing Michael, who's here at the meetup, made with Vue.js. I suppose it's mapping a sine wave. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yep. It's a little situation going on.
I made a couple different view components. There's like a plane component and then a curve component, which extends something called a relation. So like a relation is just a set of points, and then a curve has like an active point that you can toggle like with the input at the top.
Okay.
And so it's just basically that's got an x and a y, and the x is bound to that input value, and the y is just set to the sine of whatever the x is.
And are you manually changing the x, or do you have?
And the GIF,
Okay.
I'm just hitting the up button because it's like a number input.
Gotcha. I thought you could probably just do that with a set timeout and just let it run also.
Yep.
Or what is it? Set timeout is one time. There's something else that's
Interval. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Cool. Well, it is 7:03, which is our official start time for this presentation. And so we're going to talk about Vue.js, the progressive JavaScript framework. If you're not familiar with Vue.js, then I'm not sure why you're here. But basically, it is a JavaScript framework for rendering different components, different like sets of output, basically, in a very, very simple way compared to some other frameworks I've looked at. Also, a modern way in that you can break up your work into different components, and you can use the Vue CLI, command line tool to have every component in its own file and use all the modern sort of build tools, I suppose. But I'm not going to do that because
components like web components?
it in the sense that it's functionality that's broken up into little different things, but not exactly web components, not the technology that is web components. But in this example, I'm going to go through a bunch of different things, starting with the very, very basics of Vue.js. And near the end, we'll get to components, and I'll show you how to make different components and how to include them into the overall application. So first things first, let me show you what we got going on here. If we're going to work through all of these different examples that I have, and some of the examples have actual output where we can test it here. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them out on the stream chat or here in the room, and I'll add them to the list. So what I've done is I've made a Vue.js app for my Vue.js presentation, and we're going to see how that works. And by the end of it, essentially everything that I did to make this app is presented in some way in the presentation. So first things first is the Vue instance itself. This is how you define what part of your markup is the Vue application. And it's as simple as you define some sort of element with a selector. Generally, in all the tutorials and whatnot, you'll see is an ID, and that ID will be named app or something very similar. And then in your JavaScript, you instantiate the Vue class, and you pass in an object that includes this property L and the selector for the element that is the application. And that's pretty much all you need. So this is technically all you need to have a Vue app. This app doesn't do anything at all, but it is technically working. Can everybody see okay? Okay. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to go through a bunch of different parts that we add to this object that we pass into the Vue, basically this parameter that we pass into the Vue class, and we're going to add different parts to it. So the first thing we're going to look at is the data object. So here we are, we have the exact same app set up. All we have is an HTML element with the ID of app, and we're again instantiating our a new Vue instance, and we define the element at the top, and then we have this new property on the object that's passed into the Vue instance called data. And what data is an object that contains any other data that you want to be available to your Vue application. So in this example, I have simple strings set up. I have an array, and I even have another object that has further depth into it. And everything defined inside of this data object will become available to the Vue app in other parts of it. So aside from just the data, we have methods, essentially functions that will attach to this Vue object that can access this data and change the data, basically get it or set the data, as well as do anything that you need your JavaScript function to do. So that's generally it. This example only just shows that what is inside of data can really be anything. Yes?
Data always JSON.
Well, it's not technically JSON, but yes, it looks exactly like JSON. It is an object literal is what it's called in JavaScript, in just that it is that curly braces with different properties set. Those properties define their value with a colon, and you have commas after each property. But yes, it always looks like that. And what is inside of that, though, can be any other type of data variable, I suppose. So let's go on. So the other main thing that we do in Vue is, we want to template the output. So here we have an app where I've simplified the data a little bit, just with the first name and the last name, and the hobbies is still an array. And the way you put your output, or the way you express your output, I guess, in the app itself, if you consider this the template, everything inside of the app is essentially a template, is these double curly braces with the variable name. So here, the variable first should output the value of this property on the data object first. And also what's interesting to know is that everything inside of these double curly braces is JavaScript again. So if you look over here at hobbies, hobbies is an array, and so if I were to output that directly, it's just going to fail. And so what I did is I take the hobbies array and I join all the items as a comma separated list, all inside of the curly braces. So just keep that in mind. What's inside your curly braces as this templated variable is JavaScript. And the variables come directly from what is inside the data object for now. So I can click try this, and we're going to run this little app, and we should end up with what you would expect. So there we are. Jonathan Daggerhart likes programming games. It's not grammatically correct,
Yeah, he does.
but but it's factually correct. Yes.
Can I ask you a
Yeah,
quick question?
absolutely.
Wait, just go back to what you were saying. Everything inside of the double curly is. You
Is
can run regular JavaScript in there if you wanted to. If you had like another JavaScript function you just wanted to run in there, you could do that, and it will run it in the template that's returning something.
well, it's actually I suppose I don't know. I'm not a 100% expert. I should have started with
That's
this
okay.
disclaimer. I suppose it's actually it's functions and data that's bound to the Vue instance.
Okay.
So if I wanted to access like a global function, I couldn't. I don't think I could do that directly. I would probably need to. Um, Instead, what I would do is I'd use another part of Vue.js to bring that global function into the Vue instance.
Right, because you can do methods on the Vue object. Or
Yep.
On the Vue object. I guess what the reason I asked is because you've got hobbies.join, right?
Yes.
So in this case, is join a Vue.js method, or are you running JavaScript join?
No, so hobbies is a JavaScript string, and every string has the join method. As
That's what I meant.
Yep.
Like, so you can run you can run a JavaScript.
Yeah. So any of these things that I pass in, be it a so in this example, it's an array. I can, since this is actual JavaScript and that is the array hobbies, I can run all those methods that are attached to the array prototype. And the same with the string. So I could actually do last dot, I think it's 2 lowercase parentheses, and that would output the last name all in lowercase. So
Is that because it's coupled with like the templating engine?
well, it's doing the templating itself. What it's doing, and I'm just going to sort of wing this. So, but essentially, what it's doing is it is a templating engine itself, and it's every time something. So when it first loads, it automatically renders the template according to the data or the methods that you have attached in the Vue instance. And then if something were to cause that data to change, it re-renders itself. And so that'll be more apparent in some of the later examples. But basically, it is a template engine. You can think of it as a template engine that constantly re-renders itself as needed. All right. Next one. So besides just the data property, we have a computed data property, which is really just called computed. So the way computed works is it's an object also attached to the Vue instance, or rather, to be correct, the computed is a property of the object that is passed into the Vue instance when you're instantiating it, or when you're creating the Vue. So, and what it is it is an object that is full of properties, and each of these properties are actually methods. So here I have the computed. I have added to this view a computed data. So this is data that is dynamically generated every time. Or yes, so this is data that's dynamically generated. So that if I were to somehow change the first name while this app is running, the computed property is always up to date. But also what this shows is that the computed property uses data from within the Vue instance itself. So let's just take a look at this. I'm going to try it out real quick. There it is. So in the template, I've output full name. But full name is not a property of this data object. Full name is the computed data itself. And so when this template's being rendered, it runs the full name function, which returns what I have set up as this data. So look here how what is this in your functions, in your methods, and in your computed. this is a special version of the Vue is supplying a special object to bound to this computed function, and this can directly access data. Notice I don't do this dot data dot first. I just do this dot first, and it knows that that is data in the Vue instance. And the same thing happens inside of methods, which we'll look at later. So whereas data and computed are essentially just, they're both data, methods are functions that we can run within the template itself. So that we'll see more computed data in the further examples. But does anybody have questions about computed?
Can you pass an argument full name?
That's a good question. Let's answer that. So there is a way to set up computed properties, I guess, or data to have both a getter and a setter. Right now, by default, if I define full name as a function, it is a getter. So I can't set full name. I can only get it. But if I'm just gonna look this up. I hope you don't mind that I refer to documentation. But let's look up computed, and just here we go. And I'm going to go down to the getters and setters. I mainly want to answer the question if you can pass in arguments or parameters to the computed getter. Let's see. Here we are. No. So that would be the only reason you would need to pass in arguments. Okay, this makes sense. So the only reason you would need to pass in arguments to something you're running in the template is if it needs to change the way the output is. But a computed data is always that specific set. This is even my same example. This getter returns this dot first name plus this dot last name. So if I had defined my computed example with a getter and a setter, I could set the first name and last name using that computed property, but it doesn't appear you can actually pass a value into that function as a computed property. But with methods you can, and we'll look at methods shortly. So that's the basics of sort of instantiating your new Vue application and templating output as far as raw or as far as plain text output goes. The next thing we're going to look at is what is called directives in Vue. And directives are essentially, they look like HTML attributes that you add to elements throughout your template that inform that element how to act or how to how to act or what to do in case of events. And we're going to look at directives. So the first one up is VHTML. So what I just said about templating output was that when you use those curly braces, it templates that as plain text. So if I were to pass HTML in, if my data had HTML and it tried to put that into the template with the curly braces, it would actually show the HTML code. It wouldn't render it as HTML. The way that you provide raw HTML into your template is with this first directive called VHTML. And so what we see here is actually a completely different pattern from our curly braces variable output. But this still results in the same in that it is a variable output. So in this case, I've defined my Vue app and I've got a span HTML element inside there. But instead of having the curly braces output of the template, I defined this directive v-html equals full name HTML. And so this, and I changed it from the previous example, but now my computed property is called full name HTML. So this will actually output and oh, hold on. So I changed the name, full name HTML, but also it now returns HTML as well. And I probably should have included in this example it doing it wrong, but instead we're only going to see it working correctly. But so what this VHTML directive does is it says input the value of this full name HTML into this element that has the VHTML directive. And so if I try it out, we'll see that inside of this span, and I could inspect this to show you that there is a span there wrapping this, which why not? See, there is a span there wrapping the name. So inside of that span, it placed the value of full name HTML, and it actually renders it as raw HTML. So what's something else I want to point out here, though, when dealing with directives. So the same way that when we were using the curly braces, that everything inside of the curly braces was JavaScript. When we're using directives, everything inside of the directives is also JavaScript. And we'll see more examples of that in the future. But just know for now that a directive looks a lot like an HTML attribute on an element, but the contents of that directive is actually executed as JavaScript. Any questions on VHTML? If not, we're going to go to the next directives, which are conditional directives. So this is how you have if-else statements. This is a kind of an overly simplified example, but I do another example of if-else statements later. But essentially, you assign the directive to an HTML element, and you say if something, some piece of data or some computed data or some method returns true, then output that element. Otherwise, output this element. So since I've defined this little app, my data no longer has a first name. So the truthiness of first should end up being false. So if this data property first has a value, it will not have a value. So what we should see is that this div does not render at all, and the else case renders when we try it out. And there we are.
So obviously that the else has to be the next line after the closing div tag for the VF. Has to immediately follow.
I think it does have to be a sibling. I don't know if it has to be an immediate sibling. That's a good question. And I could easily open up actually, let me just add this to my list of questions. So does the velse directive have to immediately follow the vif? And so I added that to the list at the bottom. After I go through all the examples, I'll pull up I'll pull up a little window and we'll give it a shot.
How about you might have said this, but it doesn't print. The if and the else are referring to the whole div.
Yes. Okay. So with VIF, in this case, since this returned false essentially, or falsy, I guess, then this whole div does not exist. And it's not just hidden. There is a different directive for just hiding the div, but if we look in here, we can see that there is no other div above this first one.
Could that div be a span or a list item?
It can be anything. It can be any HTML element, and every now and then you'll run into some cases where you don't have an HTML element to add something to, and what you can do is you can use a special element, and I'm going to add that to the questions. We're going to say talk about the template element, and basically I'll add that to the bottom and we can try that out. But essentially it's just an element you can drop into place just to use directives sort of arbitrarily without actually having HTML being added to the page. So keep going. In addition to if-else conditional statements, we have for loops. So in this case, the directive for the for loop is v-for. And as you might imagine, everything inside of the value for that directive is JavaScript. And there's two different ways to execute a for loop. You can do it without indices, or if you need the key or the index of each item in the list, you can do it with indices in this pattern. So the difference between the two, just to verbalize it, is that you're essentially saying it for item in items. And let me first point out that my data property on this Vue instance has an array called items. So for each item in items, output the item. And if you need the indexes, you put it this way, where you say for each item, comma, index in parentheses in items, and then you have access to the index and the item itself. So I'm going to try this out. Also, I used VIF again, not for any great reason, but I guess to complicate it. Either way, there is items, so both of these should render. And here we are. We have a list that doesn't have an index available per row, and we have this other list that does have the index available per row. Since this is computer stuff, the index starts at 0 like everything else. Any questions about for loops?
If you didn't do the if, you just show like a blank item.
Well, if I didn't do the if, I guess if the reason I put that there is because it's good practice. If I didn't do the if and the items were empty, then I would have an open and close UL on the page with nothing in between. That's it. Basically, if you're gonna work with HTML that has this that have these wrapper elements, I would always sort of make sure that it has contents before outputting it. All right, moving on. All right, so methods. So we looked at data and we looked at computer data. We looked at computed data. And now we're going to look at methods. So methods are ways that you attach functions to the Vue instance. And the difference between this and a computed data is computed data always returns a value, and as we saw with the getter itself, doesn't accept any input. Whereas methods can both accept inputs and they don't have to return values. It's actually not necessarily their purpose to return values, but they can return values. So what I've done in this kind of simple example is, actually this is only a visual example. I've created two methods that take an item and add it to the items data array. So I have this instance, and in the data I have an array called items. And if I were to pass something into this method in the template, which we can see later, I guess I didn't do it here, then all it does is this method says add an item, add whatever item was passed into the function to the end of the list. And this other one is just an example of removing an item from the list by its index. So there's more examples of methods later. I guess this was just to have a look at it. Okay, so now I remember why I separated it out, because before we really look at methods, we need to look at the V on colon, I guess it's a directive. Basically what this does is V-on colon and then event name is how you bind events to your HTML elements. And a shortcut for that is just the @ symbol. So instead of V-on colon event name, you can just do @ event name, such as @click. And here in this example I used both ways. So this is building on the previous example that just showed methods. And what we have here is we have a span that is going to look like a button, because I'm bootstrapping this. And when we click it, it should remove the first item from the list, because on v-on-click execute the method remove first item. And if we look down here at the Vue application, I do have a method called remove first item. It doesn't accept any parameters. Also, we're going to have a button that is add an item, and it just adds the item basketball, to the list, because if you see now I'm actually running the method with a parameter being passed into it. And here we'll have another example of a click event where I'm going to remove a specific item from the list by index, and I'm passing the index into that remove item by index method. So let's try this out, and I think it'll make a little sense. So here's the little app. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the first item. So if I click this, it's going to execute the method called remove first item, and it did. And if we look down here at how that works, all it does is it splices out item 0 from the array. So this.items.splice, and I can add basketball to items. So there we are. We can add basketball a lot to items every time I click it. And if we look down at how this is working, it's running the add item method and just passing in the parameter basketball. If we go down and look at the method itself, the method takes one parameter, item, and it just pushes it onto the end of the array. And we've got this little trash can, which when click, let me scroll back up a little bit, executes the method remove item by index, and it passes the index in. So here we have a for loop where we're doing v4, we're getting the item and the index inside of the items array. And since I have the index, I can pass it into this method. So if I click any of these, well, it's going to be hard to tell with basketball, but if I click these little trash cans, let's get rid of this, a third thing. There we are. So if I click that trash can, it passed its index within the array into this remove item by index method, and all I'm doing is I'm splicing it out of the array. So, and just for the sake of completeness, the way splice works on the array, on arrays in JavaScript, is that the first item is the index of the item. I'm sorry, the first parameter is the index of the item. Second parameter is the number of items to remove. And there's a third parameter which we're not using, but that would add items back into it. So essentially, to remove the first items, I'm getting rid of item number 0. I'm getting rid of 1 starting at 0. And to get rid of a specific item, I'm getting rid of 1 starting at index that's passed in. So I guess it's worth noting, okay, so I just want to show one more thing real quick. Previously I talked about how every time the data changes, Vue re-renders itself. So if you notice, if I get rid of this another item at the top whose index is 0, then everything's going to move up in the array, and therefore it has a new index. And when Vue re-renders this app, this for loop gets re-executed, and every item has its new updated index during that for loop. So if I get rid of this another, all of these other items are their index is gonna decrement by 1.
If you had specified the indexes when you created the array, would it keep those indexes?
I might be. I don't know that you can do that in JavaScript. I might be totally wrong.
Index on an array?
I don't know. Let's find out. I mean, this is discussion time. So JS new array with indexes. Sure. Yeah, I guess that's what it is. Arrays in JavaScript are never associative arrays. Or no? Yeah. I mean that's
an object. I mean you can't. I don't think you can. Arrays are just simple arrays. You can't do a key value pair.
I feel like I remember trying that at one point, and like if you say my array square bracket 3 equals food, then you get an array with like null.
That's
Food.
right. Yeah, it creates the 0, 1, 2, and 3.
Oh, yeah.
0, 1, and 2.
I mean, I think
That's right, I remember that. Yeah.
well, we could try it right now, right? I'm trying to even think of how what the syntax would even look like.
You just use the square brackets and put the index in there.
Okay.
or like var my array equals empty array, and then say my array square bracket 3 equals.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, that's not. Then what do I have to do? Console log. Yeah. So there we are. So yeah, it is there, but it thinks it has a length of 4, and so items 0, 1, and 2 are all null.
Undefined.
Yeah, undefined. So
It's an object.
yeah,
JavaScript is like objects for any key value.
arrays are much more like collections in that they're magical lists, I guess. Man, any JavaScript expert watching this meetup live stream is going to be laughing. All right. Anyway, we're here to learn and discuss.
It's a Drupal meetup, not a JavaScript meetup, right?
That's right. We're off the island, baby. So, any other questions about executing methods? Or really, I'm sorry. This section is about binding events. And what we're doing is we're combining this in the previous section. And the events we're binding are click, and we're using the click event to execute our methods. Yeah, so any real JavaScript event is available. Yep, key up, key down, that sort of stuff. All of that's available. I'll move to the next one. Okay, so now we're going to talk about two-way data binding, and that is with the vModel directive. So what vModel does is it's used to map inputs such as literal input elements or select or text area. It's used to map those things in a two-way bound situation, I guess. I should have thought that sentence through before starting it. It two-way binds it to a data property. So here I have a new app. It has an input that's just text, and it has this directive vModel, which is bound in two directions to this data property name on the Vue application. And then here I use a better example of if, else if, and velse afterwards, these directives at the bottom. So I've got this input bound to name, and I have this h3 which outputs name. And I have these additional conditions at the bottom. So let's try it out. So here I have default name, which was just defined when the Vue instance was started. And it is bound, and this input is bound to that data so that I can change it. And as I change it, it re-renders. And so this input is changing the value of this data property. And as this data property changes, Vue re-renders, and the templated output of name has changed after the re-rendering. So as I type here at all, every single time I type, Vue's detected what has changed and has re-rendered in this template what is appropriate to have changed, what is appropriate to re-render. And I've got some conditionals down here to where it just says if the name, and this is an example of just using JavaScript directly inside of these things. So if name is equal to default name, then we're going to see that one div. This is default name. If it's equal to
Default.
Jonathan, just put default.
I thought it said there for a minute.
Yeah, if I put in Jonathan, it says, hey, Jonathan. And so here's an example of where I'm using more JavaScript. Name is a string, so I say if name to lowercase is equal to Jonathan. So it doesn't care about the case for this condition to work. It just tells me hello. And otherwise, besides the default and Jonathan, it has no idea who we are. So
what does vModel mean in this context? So vModel is it's listening to the variable of name. It's listening to the data name.
yeah, it's actually it is.
So like
It's set at default, but it's also listening.
Yeah, so it's
like name is a property inside data.
Mm-hmm.
So when you put vModel equals name, that's what it's referring to.
Yes, it's saying the value of this input field is equal to name, but bind it in two directions. And so let me show off that two-way binding with the console a little bit. Let me look to see what we called this app 0. I wonder if this is going to work. So do we have app 0 available? Let's see. No. It's not .data. It's actually. Let me add that to the examples to show later, because basically this whole situation that I got set up with try it now stuff.
You answered my question.
Okay. I just want to show this in the console later, and basically what it is what I'm going to show, or we may not even show now, is that if I access this directly in the console and I say this app.data.name is equal to Bobby, then that'll change the value of this text field. Changing the value of that text field will make everything re-render. And the rest of this is just showing off if and else statements more. So, any questions? Any more questions about model? A model. So, what a model does is a model sets binds in two directions, some sort of input field with a data property on the Vue instance. So, Vbond : is another dynamic, I suppose, directive. I don't know why I call it an attribute here. It's the way you define a dynamic attribute, I suppose, or yes, it's the way you define a dynamic attribute on an element. For example, if you wanted an element's class to be dynamic, then you would put v-bond : class equals some JavaScript, and that JavaScript, as the view is rendered, would decide what those classes are dynamically. A shortcut to v-bond : is just a colon itself. So what I have here is I have a simple app where I have a paragraph, and this paragraph is going to have a dynamic class, and I have an image that has a dynamic source. So let's look at this Vue instance for a second. And I have data property my classes, which is an array. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, each time it's rendered, I'm going to take my classes and join them with an empty space, and every single class will be added. And I have my email address in here, and a computed property that basically just converts my email address into the Gravatar URL for my email. So when I render this, there's my Gravatar. It's saying pull the source of this image from Gravatar source, which is computed. Gravatar source returns this URL plus an MD5 hash of my email address. And I've got all these buttons down here which just toggle classes into this array. So as I click, for example, this button, it'll just toggle the class alert success into the my classes array. Just puts it in, takes it out. And so what it's doing with all of these buttons is each button adds or removes a class from the array. The view is re-rendered because data has changed, that's important. And my classes array is then rejoined on the space. So that if we inspect this, we should be able to see those classes appear and disappear. Let's cut them all off. There we are. So right now the class is just alert for some reason. And you can see that each time I push a new class onto the my classes array, it re-renders. And since this is JavaScript, I joined them with an empty space between them. So I have made the class attribute on this HTML element dynamic. Any questions about that? And the long form, just again, the long form is v-bond : I've seriously never used that. Once you learn the shortcuts, I don't know why you would. Shortcut is just colon in front of a normal attribute for that HTML element. All right, moving on. Gotchas. So arrays have a lot of gotchas when dealing with them in Vues. And mainly it's because Vues is unable to watch the array deeply, I suppose, in that you can't directly alter elements inside of the array or items inside of the array or add items inside of the array. You either have to use array methods such as push or splice or those sorts of things. You either have to alter the array through a prototype method on that array, or you use some global methods that Vue makes available called set and delete. And here's just some examples of using those things. So the way you might use ViewSet is you just say view.set myArray. The second parameter is what you want to edit on that array, and the third parameter is the new value that you're changing it to. Alternatively, you can replace the entire array every time. So if you replace the entire array, Vue says, okay, this is new, re-render the whole thing. If you use an array, if you use one of the methods on the array prototype, Vue is able to watch that re-renders. But what it can't do is you directly editing the array through indexes. So let's try it out. I don't know what this example does. Let's see. So I've got a data property new item title. Oh, this is going to just add items to a list. And I've got an array called items. And everything I type into here is going to be added to a new list. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Hello. And so when I click this span, it executes the add item method. Add item just defines a new object and pushes it onto the array. And then it clears the form. Since the form is two-way bound, since this input field is two-way down to this data property, then when this method clears the data property, the form itself clears. So if I click add, that method sets this data to an empty string, and that clears the input field. And so add item is just pushing an item to a list. Then we look through the list, and I've got this checkbox that toggles the completed variable on the item to on and off. I'm doing a dynamic class. Maybe this example might be a little overloaded, but so the div for each item has a dynamic class, which is whether this item is completed or not. If the item.completed equals true, which is a 1 or 0, then it adds the class completed, which I have set up in my style sheet to be strike through. That's it. And if I unclick it, it removes that class. And so look at how that's happening. So when I click this, it runs the method toggle item, it passes in the index. And here the toggle item method is running view.set on this.items index, and it's changing the completed property, which is a part of that item that I added to the array. It is changing it to the opposite of itself, which is just toggling it. So not whatever it is currently valued. But the main point here is that this completed property didn't exist within the data set at all before when Vue initially rendered. So the only way I can change this in a way that Vue is aware of is by using this view.set global method. And I've got the trash can, which removes an item again. It just runs remove item on click, passes in the index, And what that does is uses the splice method again to splice that item out of the array. It removes one item starting at the index passed into it.
So in this case, an item is an object
Yes.
instead of a string.
Yes, and the reason it is because when I add an item, I create a new object and I push that object onto the array. Because I needed a way to have a status essentially of that item, whether it was completed or not. So this has got a kind of a bit going on. Any questions about this? Mainly the main takeaway here is that, and I suppose I should have shown more examples of things not working. But what I could not have done, could not have done is said, this dot items index dot completed equals 1. You can't, if you change the value of an item in an array like that, Vue doesn't know to re-render. And so the output won't update.
And that's because you're specifically in that case would be using the square bracket 1 notation. That's what it has a problem with.
Yeah, or it has a problem. It's something about just directly modifying. I guess so.
Like if it was
Yeah.
item was an object and it was just one object that was an item
Mm-hmm.
and not an array, you could say like this dot item dot completed because you're not like accessing an array item, you're using an index that way.
Right. Yeah. So if items was an object, I'm not sure how
I
well.
was just thinking
he
like
can-
a singular item
Mhm.
instead of being an array. You have item equals an object literal.
Yeah. So this gotcha is specifically accessing by index is specifically a gotcha with arrays, but with objects it has a similar gotcha, and that is that the property you're modifying must have existed on the object when Vue last rendered for it to know for it to be able to watch it. So you can't add a new property to an object directly and Vue be aware of it. If I had a object I wanted to do, say I wanted to add to an item a new property called description, I would have to use view.set the item description and then the value for it to know to re-render.
But it would have to exist when you created new item initially.
No, so if it doesn't exist when I initially create it, I have to use view.set. If it did exist, I can access it directly when dealing with objects.
Can
And
you force a redraw?
yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, so can I force a redraw? It would really depend on. You can force a redraw by changing data. If I change any data inside of here, it'll redraw. It'll only redraw what it finds appropriate, or basically what it'll do is it'll redraw the differences between the two. So if I wanted to redraw the whole app, really, I could just start adding new items to this data object, and it would redraw.
There's probably I bet you there's a method to re-render the whole app, like reinitialize the app or something.
Well, let's see.
But, I mean, I couldn't think of a case why you would want to use that unless you were doing something funky, like inserting data and then you wanted to re-render the whole app with new data. It's probably a better way to do it.
Yeah, detach and remount elsewhere. So I'm trying to think of the use case that I would Google to get the answer. Basically, I think the right way to answer would be to say that it should know when to redraw. If you need to force it to redraw in some way, then chances are you might need to just write your app slightly differently so that when you need it to redraw, it changes a data point. And it could just be setting some random new data value from false to true or from 1 to 2, or if you really needed to force it to redraw and it wasn't already doing it on its own, then just add some data
Probably
to the object.
kind of breaking outside of philosophy of the way that Vue wants you to do stuff.
Yeah, well, I
The
might
pattern.
wonder if there's if like if you think you need to force it to redraw, then you may have done something wrong. You might need to look back at the way you've got the whole app, the way you've got this sort of app or component set up to see if and question why you need it to redraw, I guess. I don't know if that's helping or answering the question at all. But yeah, so this is just basically this section is just a heads up that there are some gotchas with arrays, and what's going to happen is you're going to play around with making a Vue app, and you're going to try to change an array, and it's not going to work, and you're going to say, oh yeah, and you're going to look it up, and you're going to find Vue.set. I'm just predicting this. I'm Nostradamus all y'all, I guess.
We will all do this.
Yes. All right. So let's move on. Okay, components. So components are how we can break up different parts of our app into little different reusable chunks, essentially. And for example, I didn't do this with my presentation here, but if you look at my presentation app on a whole, to me it would make sense that this little form is its own component. Maybe this completed list is its own component, and even like certain parts of each item could be a component. Like this little showing the code and the try it thing could be a component. It's just a way to have common functionality become reusable throughout your application. So with Vue, there's a couple of ways to define a component, but I'm not a build tools guy. I'll pause for laughter. So what I do is just very straightforward. Just JavaScript. So what I do is I define a new object literal that has a name, and I give it the property template. This is the only property that is completely necessary. But I give it a property template, and that template is a string, essentially, of whatever HTML this component contains. In this example, the template is a whole bunch of paragraphs. And then in the app itself, okay, well keep going. And then when defining the Vue app instance, I have this new property on the Vue object called components that is an object itself, and I pass in as a property name, I pass in whatever I want this component to be called, and its value is that object literal that I just defined. So in this case, I made them completely different to sort of express that point. But my component name is my component explaining components. And here in the app's HTML, just like normal HTML markup, I suppose, or an element, I have this new element that I can use multiple times. I can use it over and over again. I could copy and paste this 3 more times, and it would just repeat that component over and over again. And that element name is whatever I called it down here when passing that new object into the components property. So let's run this real quick, and we should see that I probably should have had some text outside of that component, but basically my app itself is nothing but the component, and it is rendering that component inside of the app. And I've got a bunch of text here talking about it. Let's see. This is probably supposed to remind me what.
You got data explanation, that last paragraph of the template.
Yes. So, okay, so important. See, that's underlined and everything. So it's important to know that a component template can only have one root level element. So you almost always have to open and close a div or something at the very beginning of your template. If this div wasn't here and it had 4 root level paragraphs, it would just break. It just wouldn't run at all. So I wrapped my 4 paragraphs inside of one div. That's important. And also, your components can have a data property that just have their own data in them, as well as they can have their own computed data, and they can have their own methods, etc. It should look a lot like what can go into a component looks a lot like what goes into the Vue definition itself. But one little caveat is that the data property inside of a component is actually a function that returns an object. And that's probably for good JavaScript internal reasons. I don't know why that's the case, but that's the way you have to do it. Note, in components, data is a function that returns an object with your data there. So in this component definition, I have a paragraph that is outputting data explanation. And as it's rendered, there it is. Also note how the data property is now a function. So if I wanted to have lots of data, it would just be different properties on this returned object. So that's the basics of a component. You define an object literal that has a template property, and then you pass it into the greater Vue app with whatever name you want it to have in this case. Any questions about that so far? Okay. Well, so the next thing we might want to look at is how can we take data. We're going to look at component properties. How can we take data from the greater Vue app and pass it into the component? So now the component has data that is being supplied to it dynamically from the app. Yeah, dynamically from the app, but also I'm confused. There's a lot of reuse of the words here. So the component has data being supplied from the greater app itself, and it can have static data. The way you pass data into a component is just attributes. They look like normal HTML attributes, and it can be static, such as just some raw text passed in, or you can put a colon in front of it and it becomes dynamic. And so this dynamic property takes the value name from the greater Vue app and passes it in. So the one thing you have to do though is you have to tell the component itself to expect these properties. So, and you do that by defining an array inside of the component called props, and you just tell it the names of the properties it expects. So in this case, this component expects 2 properties, one called static property and one called dynamic property. And since it expects it, you're now able to use these as data, templatable data within your component. So here we are outputting whatever static property is, and here we are outputting whatever dynamic property is. So let's run this real quick. And let's just see what's happening is we made this component. We added it to our Vue instance. The Vue instance also has some data. In our application, we output the component and send in the value of static property as this is normal text. Here we go. And the value of this called dynamic property is name, which is pulling name from the data. It's dynamic. So I put a colon in front of it. This should look just like all the other v-bind stuff in that everything inside of this is JavaScript. Everything inside of this that does not have the bound colon in front of it is just normal text.
Did you use like the double curly braces in that static property value?
It would just be I don't know. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Can the Grader app render that as plain text? Basically, you're kind of asking about the order of rendering it. So with this, if I did something like, let me just,
double brackets, name. Put it,
right, if I, yeah, saying if I did this, would it work? And I'm just going to assume not. I might be wrong, but do we want to look at that later? We'll probably have
no,
time.
it's all right.
I honestly just don't know.
I feel like the answer is no, and I only think that because like I started trying to do it that way before I realized the correct way is with the colon. Like I would try to do a property
Makes
with
sense.
no colon in
Yeah.
front, and then try to use the angle brackets, and it just broke. And I was like, what is this?
But there's
Yeah.
anywhere else you can use the double brackets.
Right.
And it,
But you can't actually, yeah. In general, I don't think you can use the double brackets inside of any attributes at all.
okay.
Yeah.
The other question I had was
Okay.
your case, you're using all lowercase for your variable name. Is that a convention of Vue, or just is there a reason you didn't capitalize the P in property?
No, there's no reason. I'm pretty sure that we could do that. That
It is case sensitive,
I-
I'm assuming.
I think it is. It is. I believe it's case sensitive. Let's do ask that question afterwards. Let's see, property. Let's see, component property names. Case sensitive or something like that. Or it's like, how much does case matter? I suspect that it has to be a legal JavaScript variable, and that case probably does matter.
Right. that's
So,
what I would expect.
I bet it can't have a space or
Right.
yeah.
I would expect it's using JavaScript names, and I was just curious why if there was a reason that you didn't.
Nah, there wasn't. That's
Right.
it's just a bad example, I guess. Yeah, but we'll look at that.
Submit a pull request.
Yeah, this is on GitHub, by the way. I
Because
should have
everything
shared
else
this link.
was I mean, you got all the, like, my component is, you did all the camel case, everything else, like, I was wondering, is there a reason for that?
No, I think I just started with the word static and dynamic, and then later added the word property to it, and just
Yeah.
it was late. It
Yeah.
was.
That's awesome. You're doing
Okay.
No, this is really
Yeah.
good. Give me a break.
You cut me some slack. No, yeah.
There
is
is
awesome.
one sort of question.
Okay.
It said, interesting. I wonder why Vue.js opted not to keep the separate data and computed properties when building components.
Oh, well, actually, it does. So components also have computed as a property where you return dynamic data. So in the example before, let me go get that example. In the example before, this data still needs to be static data, essentially. And it's just that for some reason you have to return an object from the function. And I believe that has more to do with when the component is first created than anything. And basically what it is when the component is first created, it probably has no data at all. And so later it's going to call data as a function to get those values, as opposed to, and actually I'm making this up, so I don't know. Let's just say I don't know, because I'm more likely wrong than not. But for some reason in components you have to return a function. But also components do have computed as a property. It also has methods.
So the template using backtick instead of regular?
Yeah, so this, I don't know what ES the backtick belongs to, but in JavaScript, is it 6?
Yeah, for the backtick template.
Yeah, the backtick just lets you pass in variables. So like in JavaScript, you can define a string with backticks. You can say blah, blah, and then $, braces, some variable. blah, and that will render the string with this variable executed or replaced within it.
Like double quotes in PHP.
Right. Yep.
Instead of
Backticks.
concatenating the string with the pluses,
Right.
if you want to make a JavaScript variable, you have like open and close and then a plus and then a variable. That's the new way of doing it with the S6, where you don't have to break out of your string to concatenate.
Yeah. So
Yeah, there you go.
this is the common, like, this is sort of like the not ES6 way to do it, where you just concatenate a string, and backticks lets you render variables inside of a string.
And also lets you have line breaks, which is probably why you did it.
That is exactly why I did it. You can also have line breaks. In JavaScript, you can't have line breaks like that inside of a single string. Instead, you got to concatenate each row, like that.
You just slash.
Basically, backticks are better in every way, and so that's why I did it. Just for strings that have special characters like line breaks, or you want to render variables into them. But yeah, I should have pointed that out. Thanks for bringing that up. I always use backticks. Also, it doesn't when using backticks, especially when inside of that is HTML. I don't have to worry about using double quotes or single quotes for every single thing. So quotes don't break the backtick string.
Does it keep the formatting? It keeps the whole formatting.
Yep, it keeps all the formatting. Here I did a string because there's nothing special going on inside that string. But all right, components, component properties. What did we do? Did we do this? Yeah, and we had weird questions. I wonder if I undo that and rerun it. Oh yeah, it undid that. Sorry, it sort of reset that item in my list. So let me reiterate real quick. To pass some static variable value into a component, it's just some attribute with a value sent in. And if you need it dynamically provided, if you want to dynamically provide a variable to the component, you use that colon and the variable name. If you're using the colon, everything inside the parentheses is JavaScript. Sort of the same old. And to accept properties, a component must have those properties defined in an array.
Would you say that the props and the data pretty much exactly the same thing, except props can be passed through as attributes? You can still call this dot static property even though it's not in data.
Yeah.
I think of them as kind of the same, except I don't really know if that analogy breaks down at any point.
No, I think that's right as well. So if I had a method, I could say this dot static property to access that value. I suppose I could change it as well, and it'll change. I'm guessing it'll change inside of this component. I'm not positive. No, because what's going to happen is if you try to change it, Vue's going to re-render, and then the parent will repass the original value down. So I don't think you can even change it meaningfully.
Okay. Yeah, that's why a lot of this stuff is so kind of like strictly done because of the magic behind Vue is the fact that it pre-renders things so quickly because it's text changes and the data or text changes need to happen in DOM and instead of refreshing the whole page, it just pinpoints what it needs to do, and that's why people are doing their single page applications because it's so fast.
Yeah.
So they're like. That's why things have to be done in kind of the Vue way to help it do its thing of being super fast. Right.
Yeah.
The props.
Mm-hmm.
They are being passed as attributes to my component.
Mm-hmm.
Could they be passed in the data of the Vue app? Could you have like data name John Down? Could you have data static property? Could you pull it from there?
Well, so
and not pass it in the HTML code,
I would say no. At that point, you're dealing with a dynamic property. Basically, if you want to send data, a static property is for sending
something from,
a string, basically just a string.
I mean, components usually have methods on them, right?
Yeah.
That's,
None of my components have
I guess you
methods.
don't
In
really need that. Yeah, they're really just chunks of reusable code. So you don't really need a method.
No, but if this form was set up as a component, it would probably have its own methods. And a component can't send data back to the parent. It's all down from the parent. So if I had built this to where the form was its own component and this list was a different component, that's where you have to start bringing in a global state. And then what you have is you have child component A changes the values in that global state, and that global state then reperpetuates down through the parent and then through all. Yeah.
Vuex, have you looked into Vuex?
Yeah, I've used Vuex a little bit, but I didn't include it in this presentation just because.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but I do get into
Pretty
Vue
cool.
routing next. Yeah, it's kind of neat, but I don't think I'm good enough with it to really know the best way to use it. It's sort of
Definitely
complicated.
probably not going to fit into a 2-hour talk.
Yeah. No, yeah. So basically, if you want to send a variable into a component, it's a dynamic property.
One quick thing.
Yeah.
So somebody said when using backticks, I think that's called template literals. That's E6, right? So you'd need Babel for that, right? B-A-B-E-L.
Let's see. I don't have Babel, but I think Chrome is just saving me a lot.
Yeah, I think newer browsers are just able to use ES6, but it's still best practice probably to.
It is called template literals.
Yeah, if you're doing any compiling, you need Babel to translate.
So template literals, according to MDN, is everywhere but Internet Explorer, which isn't a big surprise.
That's crazy, man.
Yeah, but yeah. So what? I mean, you probably still. I don't know how much longer we're going to care about Internet Explorer, but you probably still do need Babel to reliably use that on a public client situation.
Yeah.
And what Babel's going to do is just convert it into a bunch of strings that are concatenated. But yeah, so I still haven't done that. I mean, it's worth noting out that I had to look that up. I still haven't done a important client-facing Vue application. So chances are I may be using tricks like template literal that just aren't ready for prime time. If you're developing an app for the masses, then you probably do want build tools, Babel, and whatnot.
And build it all into like a bundle like Webpack would do.
Yeah.
So it's all in one file.
Yeah, and if you do that, you can actually define components in a different way. So Vue component, what's it called? Single file or something? If I could. Well, you get like a command line tool where
yeah,
you.
it's .vue file, right?
Yeah, where you can define your components like this, where you have a little template bracket where all your templating goes. Scripts just exports an object literal, just like everything else. So the difference between this single file component and what I'm doing is that the template here at the top is inside of my object literal, and that's about it. And I guess you can do CSS too. But inside of the single .vue file that you need build tools for, it's still basically doing the exact same thing. It's just sort of broken up in a way that's more convenient for your code editor, I guess.
One cool thing you can do too is on the style tag, you can say lang equals SCSS, and then you can type SCSS in there.
Right. That is cool. Yes.
And the scoped, this scoped is pretty cool too, because that means if it's scoped, it
It
only does the styles on that one component, so
Right.
they don't conflict.
Must know how to do that in some smart way. But yeah, so you do get some nice style stuff, features with a single page component when you're doing it with build tools and all. Frankly, if you're gonna build like a real public for the masses app, you probably want to do it the build tools with single file templates or single file components. But it's worth noting how the difference between that and what I'm doing is okay. As far as the CSS goes, it's pretty handy to do it the other way. But the difference between the template and the script is practically nothing. My template is just inside of the object literal. But yeah, okay. Any other questions about components? I probably should have made more components with methods and computed values and whatnot. Apologies for that. I do make more components in the next section when we get into dynamic routing, which is going to be interesting to see if that works. I haven't done it from this URL before, but if not, let's go take a look. Okay, Vue routing. So single page application, you need to reload parts of the page. You need to route, and you need that route to be revisitable. You need it to affect the history of the browser, so you can click the back button. You need links that change out what component is completely being viewed, and that's where the Vue-router library comes in. So the way you add, I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. The way you add a Vue-router to your Vue instance is, well, first you include the script in your HTML. I didn't show that in my example, but believe me, you got to include the JavaScript. But then above defining your app, you're going to say vue.use Vue-router. And these other things are how you build your routes. So what I did is I've created 3 different components, super tiny components that are nothing but simple templates. And then I created a new instance of the Vue-router where I defined routes as an array full of objects, and those objects have a path and a component. So that's sounds like a lot, but basically I have a path that's just /, and when visiting that path, it is going to render the home page component in place of this router view. And the same for the blog route and the profile route, just renders these different components. So in the app markup itself, the way you use this router view element, I suppose, or it's probably a component. The way you use this router view component to place the output of your route. So whenever I change my route, that'll always be re-rendered here, the new route. And the way you create links to your route is using this router link component. And the simplest way to do it is with the to attribute and just the path. So if I try this out, I've got 3 links, home, blog, and profile. And, and watch the URL up here at the top, okay? So as I visit the blog, well, first of all, note that it added the hash /. That's just sort of, common JavaScript routing so that the page doesn't change as we change the URL. So if I click blog, now the URL has changed to /blog, and it has gone and gotten the blog component and rendered it in place of this router view component. And if I click profile, it's done the same thing. It's grabbed on the path profile. It has grabbed the component profile and provided that as the router view. And if I change the URL directly to just blog and hit enter, I mean it's still routing. It's watching the URL, and the router is responding to the URL. The router links are changing the URL. The router view is responding to the URL. And that's just the most basic form of routing. Pretty straightforward. Oh, I guess I missed one point. So I've got my components wherever they come from. I've instantiated a new Vue-router that has routes as an array, and there are all these objects. And also I pass the router into the Vue instance itself when I instantiate it. Yeah.
So there's that too, is that relative to this page? Is that relative to the server? Is it?
Oh,
is it going to have the hashtag?
Yeah.
It's always going to be hash slash.
Right. All your routes will always be after the fragment, I guess, the hash. And that's so the browse that's tricking the browser is what it's doing.
You can get rid of that with history.
Yeah. There is a history mode that you can in Vue-router it's just a property. So in Vue-router there's actually another property that I could add here when setting it up called yeah, it's just called history. But for some reason when I tried it out at 11:30 last night, it refreshed the page and I'm like, nah. So if you don't want this hash, and it might be because like I'm just doing flat HTML or something. If you don't want that hash in your URL, there is a mode on Vue-router. Let's see. Right. That's the thing is I'm showing normal HTML all with relative included CSS and JavaScript, and that's coming through this GitHub preview app or something.
Yeah, so probably if it was on like a host.
But here it is. Yeah, you can just set the mode to history, and that'll drop the hash. But I believe, can I hit the back button? What do you think?
Yeah.
Yep. Back and forward. So it's recording the history. That mode history, I think, is really just tricking the URL bar.
Yeah, it's just to get the hash out of it, make it pretty.
Yeah.
Prettier. What people are normally.
Yeah. So that's the
terrible.
very basics of routing. And so, okay, so when you're dealing with bigger applications where you've got a router and the router is made of a bunch of different components and only the parent can send components data, the components can't send data back to the parent. That's where you start to adopt a global state, and that's where you bring in Vuex, which is spelled like that, Vuex. And it is the way you implement it is actually it looks a lot like this. You'll define a new instance of Vuex, and then you'll tell Vue to use Vuex. We can just look at that real quick, but I didn't have time to make a example. So of course all of their examples are using build tools, but I imagine you get the idea. If not, then get the idea. Maybe there's here we are, yeah. So it calls that global state the store. That's kind of just like the common word they use for it all the time. So you create a new instance of Vuex, and then you tell Vue to use Vuex. And then you start getting all the special stuff dealing with the global state. But all that is just to say that when you start dealing with routing and lots of child components, you probably need to fold in that global state at the same time, Vuex. For these examples, I did not take it that far. So let's look at dynamic routing. What if the route is unknown or depends on an argument or whatever? Well, that's not a problem either. So you might recognize this little colon, and that is where we can pass properties into the router view itself. But also we define our routes to expect arguments. So let's go down here and take a look at how I've defined my router. So I've got my components, which were a little more complicated. Now my blog component expects a property that is posts, and I have a component called post instead of profile that expects a property called post, singular. And now when I'm defining my routes, I've got this new, a little more complicated post route, which as part of the path expects a dynamic parameter called ID. We know it's dynamic because it has a colon. Basically, I guess that's the theme of tonight is there's a colon in front of something in Vue, it's dynamic. But I've also named this route, and I've just named it post so that I can access this route. I can create links to this route by its name. I don't necessarily have to do it by path. And I've told it I'm kind of doing a lot of examples in one here, but I've told it that this route also accepts properties, and that whatever parameters are passed into the router link becomes a property on the component itself. So that means that when I define my router links up here, oh, no, that's not here. When I define my router links, they're going to have to pass in all that post information. We're going to have to see this in action. So I got my home page, and I've got my blog, and now my blog has a bunch of post items in it, and each one of those is its own post. So they're all using the same component, post, but each route is passing in the post ID as a parameter, as well as the post object itself. And it may be a little hard to see this because it's happening inside of this unhighlighted component, but inside of the blog component is where these links come from. So here inside of the blog component, I'm looping through a list of posts. Let me take one step back and start at the top. My app has data defined called post. It's just items with objects that I've made up. And all those objects have an ID, a title, and a body. And that's it. So, in a real world, you would probably load this post data with Ajax or something like that. But here I've just made up a bunch of dumb posts. And then when it renders the router view, the app is passing posts into all the router views. Well, they don't all care, but blog cares. Blog is expecting that property post. And so now inside of my blog component, I can loop through posts, and I make a new router link to each one. So again, this is not highlighted, but this dynamic link has a lot going on. So no longer is to expecting static data, but it has a colon in front of it, so it's expecting dynamic data. And I'm passing in this object with information about the route we expect to create, as well as the data that's sent to that route. So I'm actually accessing the route by name, post. If you see where I define my route, it has a name post. That's how I tell it which one to do, which component essentially to use. And I'm passing in parameters of ID, which is just this post ID. And that ID becomes the path itself, becomes part of the path. And I'm passing in the parameter post, which is how, passing in the parameter post. And so then when we visit that component, it expects the property of post, singular, and is able to render properly because it has all the data we need. And I set this up with a dynamic post ID, got the post title, post body.
So in line 12,
Mm-hmm.
you've got post : space post.
Yeah.
The first post is the post that's identified in line 19.
No, this is just overly complicated. Okay, so let's go through all the word post in this line.
Thank you.
String.
Yeah, this is a string. This is the name of the route as defined here.
Okay.
So this is an object. So
Okay.
property name is the string post, and then property parameters is an object that has two properties, ID and post. The value for ID is the post. This is all happening. One second. This is all happening within a loop in which I say post in post. I really should.
Hard thing.
I should have called
Naming
it
things.
naming things is hard. I should have called this like inside the loop post. Okay.
Right, yeah.
So
okay.
so this is inside the loop post. It's saying the property of parameters ID has the value of inside the loop post ID, and the parameter of post is set to inside the loop post. I'm gonna work on this one a little bit. For the next time I give this presentation, I'm gonna call it something else.
Naming things is hard.
It is hard. But I guess so. The point of all this is to actually compare these two links. So this link is just passing in a static value of / as where that link goes, whereas this link is passing in a dynamic information into the to attribute, and it's saying get the route by name and pass into the route all of this information as parameters, and that's what it's saying. So that when we visit that route post, it actually has it, since our link passed in the information about the blog post, the post component knows what the blog post is. All right. Yes. Sorry.
It says, I don't think you've actually specified an ID parameter for the post component.
For the post component. No. Okay. So what that is the ID parameter. So yes, post doesn't have the property. So inside of the post component, I could not use just ID directly, and that has to do with the way this route works right here. So when I set props equal to true on a route, it means pass all of parameters, all of the params into that component. But aside from that, what I definitely need is a param called ID. So in this case, I definitely need a param called ID. So this is totally required to even get to the route, so that the link even knows how to build itself correctly. But also,
post ID is defined in the data down there.
Down below.
yeah,
Down underneath.
Keep going.
yeah,
So
it's
just by
I think
putting
that
it
was
in
where I
the
was
path.
at.
I think that was
yeah.
the question.
Yeah,
For-
I think you are defining it down in the bottom.
Yeah,
Right there.
I think that
Yeah.
was the question. The question might have been,
Oh, I'm sorry.
where's ID defined?
Oh, okay.
Who's got it?
Okay, yeah. So it's at the parent level.
But just by having it in that path is where it's saying, okay, I need this ID.
Yeah, so for this path to be dynamic, I must pass into router links to this route a param called ID. I have to. And in addition to that, I'm passing in the post called post. What's the big deal?
Did you do a quick? Did you say when you a quick find how many instances the word post?
Yeah. No. I refuse to embarrass myself for you, Dan. What can I do, Kyle?
Oh, it was actually answered. I was
Okay.
wondering about ID and post ID because
Yeah, so what's kind of confusing here is that I'm doing this inside of a loop. I mean, one thing that's kind of confusing here is that I'm doing this inside of a loop. So this word post, I should have at least put quotes around the attribute, around the properties. This word post is one item from this list.
Sorry, I asked the question.
So post.id is
Maybe
coming
need to
from
like do
here.
a swap to using item and items and post.
Absolutely should have, yeah. And I can,
Next time this will be better.
I could do that, just not now. But I'm not gonna. Excuse me. Yes. No.
I was kind of actually just last night struggling with how the route params, like if it's going to be like /post/ID,
Mhm.
like how does that use the params object? And I kind of think, I'm curious if you know, but I think that you have to have a named root in order for the params to work that way.
Yeah.
Do you know?
To breathe, so it's kind of back to the question about like static and dynamic. So I could have static 2 equals /post/1,
Yeah.
just static.
Yep.
But if I need that to be dynamic, then I have to do :2 equals,
Yeah.
and at that point I need to pass in JavaScript, so it needs to be a named route. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, because what I was trying was like :2, and then I had an object, and I said path/posts params ID post.id or whatever, and that didn't work. And I didn't experiment with named params, or named routes, but I saw that in the documentation, and I think I ended up just like doing concatenation to where it says 2 equals post/plus post.id.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna wonder if you could do 2, so dynamic 2, and
Yeah.
then do /path as a string, and then post.id. Is that what you're?
And I think I tried that, and that maybe didn't work. But what I did, I had 2 as an object, and the object had a path property, and on that path property, I used concatenation with the ID. But I should probably just try making a named route, and that would probably work a lot better.
Yeah, at some point, because I mean,
Because not everything you want to pass in, like the post object you passed as a param, you couldn't pass that to the URL because it's an object.
right.
So some stuff you probably have to pass that way.
Yeah, at basically, so these other examples are sort of like simple, bare minimum stuff. But I think when it comes to building anything even slightly complicated, name all your routes. Anything, because basically, like any system with complex routing has name for routes, because how do you generate dynamically a link to something without a common canonical name that you can just keep asking for? So like, get me the route named something. And you can, I mean, so quick tie into Drupal, if you're familiar with routing in Drupal 8, routes have names in Drupal 8, and the way you can generate dynamic routes, or the way you can generate a link dynamically, is you can get a route by name, pass in an argument, and that's how it knows to build that URL. And I suspect that's just a very common pattern with any complex routing. Yes, so note taken, rename some of my variables. Got it, no problem. Any other question about routing? And I guess, in case you didn't notice, the URL is changing whenever I visit one of these. And I do have this other point to make, like how does this go back button work? I'll show you that real quick. It's JavaScript, yeah. So inside of the component or Vue instance, you have access to the router itself, and you can tell it to go through the history in a direction. So a positive number goes forward into the history, and a negative number goes backwards into the history. Yeah. So this is saying take us back one history.
So that's a method in router.
Yeah.
Router.go. Okay.
Right. So it's actually attached to the Vue instance that's available everywhere. So if I wrote a method, called what? Well, when you tell Vue.use Vue-router, then you're supplying the Vue app with the router, and what Vue does is it binds it to everything else. Basically, it binds it to whatever that magical thing is that everything is bound to in Vue. So the inside of a method, you can do this dot router like that inside of a method on the Vue app. You can do that. Yeah. Generally, though, that might be okay. There's something that was listed on the router, sort of like best practices not to do.
You can specify a URL, or is it just go history go?
Yeah. Oh yeah. You can specify a URL. So programmatic navigation. You can. I mean, if you push onto so history is just a list. So you push into the history a named route with parameters, and that's going to send the browser there. Yeah, and this, what was I saying here? Yeah, so, you know, basically it's like, it's basically saying don't do things the way I just did them with my back button. So my back button is an example of how what it's doing is it's coupling the router to the component, which, I mean, whatever. Do what you want. This is my lesson.
It's probably again has something to do with efficiency.
And
A lot of the little things that they say not to do in this and React, it seems to me, have to do with keeping it speedy. Like doing the React way, it has to do with the efficiency of removing things and adding things to the DOM.
yeah, and it's probably a lot of best practices too. Like if I start adding router stuff to every component, then that couples every single one of my components to the Vue-router, so they're no longer reusable in apps that don't have the router.
It might like redraw it when it shouldn't have to.
Yeah. Any other questions about dynamic routing? All right. Well, that should be the end, but we have all these other questions. Talk about. Well, we did that. I don't remember what talk about was about. So does Vue else have to be directly after? Well, I want to know though. It definitely has to be a sibling. Does it
It's got to
have?
be like in the vicinity, otherwise it can't keep up with that.
Yeah. I guess it's also worth noting there's a directive we didn't talk about called v-show. If you just want something to be hidden, you can be it's still rendered on the page but display none. You use v-show. V-if directive actually will not render it if false. Let's see.
So v-show is the same thing as v-if except for its display none.
Yeah. V-if, it will not be on the page at all. V-show will be there but display none. Let's see. Oh, here's an example of the template thing I was talking about. If you need to put a directive on just something arbitrary without an HTML element, this template component is basically just a nothing. It won't output anything. And that's just how you add a directive sort of into the ether. Yeah, it's useful, especially like, stop jumping. So like just a random for loop in the middle of nowhere, and you don't have anything great to attach it to. Yeah.
Or if you want to have that single root level element.
Yep.
Must immediately follow the VF.
There you go. Thank you. Yes, so they must be immediate siblings.
That makes sense.
Yeah. It seems like it would be easier to code for. Do we want to show a two-way binding example? In that, yeah. Well, why don't we do that real quick because it's super easy.
So before James was talking about console.dir, dir parentheses app _0 could be used
Oh,
to get the data property.
console.dir,
Yeah.
like that. So the way I'm actually running these little examples is with eval. I'm not sure I'm not sure how much of that is available, but I can show it over here because this is a part of the global app. So I can say app.data. I think I call it .question. Yeah, equals hello. And so, I mean, that's just an example of two-way, of it being two-way bound in that if anything at all changes that data, this text area is modeled on data.question, and if it changes anywhere, it changes everywhere. That's kind of the point of two-way binding.
Yeah. So like if there was an output over here, input over here, and output down here.
Yes.
Just getting all that.
For the people at home, he's putting his hands in wildly different locations.
And then you type it in, and then it appears here and here. But if something from the outside changes these outputs, it's going to change everywhere.
Yep. Yeah, if you're using that V model two-way binding. Bam. Component property names. How much does case matter? It's a great question that I'm going to Google instead of making an example of. Actually, if it doesn't matter, there's not going to be a lot of Google results. So
Just put in view case sensitive.
property names case. There we go. Okay, so components. Components have properties. There is this other way to define components that you don't need to worry about. I'm scrolling super slow. It's
They probably are. I mean, I'm sure they would be.
Oh,
Everything else
Yeah.
in JavaScript is
yeah.
Here we go. All right, so camel case versus kebab case. HTML attributes are case insensitive HTML attributes. That's the trick there. So when using non-string templates, camel case property names need to use kebab case, hyphen delimited. So
using non-string.
So using-
Oh, so those are just, so that goes for the custom,
So
that goes for properties as well. Yeah?
oh, okay. So this is kind of like how if you ever use the data property on elements, you define it data dash something, whatever you want the name to be.
Yeah.
But the result is camel case when you're dealing with it in JavaScript. Am I interpreting this right? So the
Yeah, it's the same with if you want to, like if you want to do JavaScript, if you want to do like a CSS property in JavaScript, it's always camel case. Like background color would be background color camel case if you want to change.
Yeah, but here, that my message.
you mean kebab case, the dash.
The kebab
Oh.
case is tied to that camel case, my message, and the prop. So those are it's using that. Wow, that's not what I expected.
So like,
Let's try it out to make sure that I'm parsing this correctly because I don't read Word good. So what we need is something with a child component, which could be the very first example. Don't worry about this mess. These are just all my examples. Here's the first child component. Here's the first one where we pass in a property. So we're going to define it here as static dash property, dynamic dash property. And here it's JavaScript.
It's going to be static capital.
So we're expecting that, right? Let's
Right.
camels.
I
Yeah.
guess it didn't matter before because you didn't have the dashes in.
Right. I saved myself this understanding. I saved myself from having to know this. I believe that's what it's saying. So if I open this up wherever I've
That's
saved
why
it,
it wasn't working. You tried it one way and it didn't work. And you figured out in case it works.
there's no telling what I was thinking. I did this. So let's show all. And which one are we looking at? Components. The second components example. Components, properties. So let's see if it works. It works. Yes, so kebab case attributes become camel case JavaScript
never
variables.
heard
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
That's a, I'm going to have, I'm going to that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Gotta remember that. I like that.
Yeah.
Right.
You learn
Well,
new things.
going through the,
Great.
I like
takeaway.
Well, if there are any other questions?
Templating.
Yeah.
For me, just feels sticky writing HTML inside my article. Is there a way to like require or pull in partial?
I think at that point you're talking about build tools because otherwise you would need something that builds the component because when the component is being loaded, the template must exist and be ready. So there's no way to load a component that has no template that then goes and gets a template that so you're talking about build tools, yeah, and in that
they probably have something that we can use in JSX. And just put, I mean, it might not make you feel any better, but you might be able to just like. But I know what you mean. That was
Yeah.
when I first started looking at Vue, because React handles it. It's very similar to this. That's why I brought it up before. It's really similar to Vue, but not that I'm an expert either, but React handles it by bringing JSX and build tools in. JSX just means that you can put HTML code inside of a Java. You know what JSX is? Yeah. Okay. So it just feels a little better.
Yeah.
You know.
I think at that point you use the Vue CLI and incorporate it with your build tools, and you build your components as single file components like this.
Oh, that's
So-
true. Yeah.
So that your HTML is in that template up top, and your highlighter will look good.
There you
Yeah.
go. Yeah, it's just a standalone file. What bothers me about that is the style tag.
You don't have to use the style tag.
Really? Well, never mind. We're at the end of this thing.
Yeah. Well, so we're good here. Thanks everybody, and don't look at that! Don't look at that! You've seen too much. But I hope y'all have a great month, and we'll see you at another Drupal meetup sometime. Thanks, y'all. Bye. Ah!
Oh, God.
No.